Dragon Ball is one of the few pieces of media across the globe that I feel confident in saying 99% of the people currently engaging with the medium of anime and manga have at least some experience with, more than likely through its anime or manga. But if not, then the numerous pieces of media that came after that contain the DNA of Dragon Ball. Even if they haven't finished, or flat out dislike it, they've seen one of the many iconic moments within the series in passing. The series is utterly inescapable and impossible to remove from our cultural zeitgeist. Dragon Ball is one of those stories that transcends the medium it's from, as not only has its sense of adventure bled into the fantasy genre of games, animation, and even books, but you can find the expectations for even Western action series to forever have Dragon Ball over their shoulder. I would classify Dragon Ball in a similar vein to Marvel or Star Wars, in the sense that the franchise is so large that even if a vocal part of the audience were to dislike the direction a new entry goes, the series is far too big to fail. Point is, Dragon Ball is a titanic media franchise, but we all knew that. However, what's much less known is much of what came before Dragon Ball in terms of Weekly Shonen Jump's catalog. I'm assuming most people online watching this sort of content know Dragon Ball isn't the first Jump or Shonen series more broadly. However, what I believe is still prevalent in the space of battle shonen discussion is the over-attribution of popular tropes and ideas contained in the magazine to just Dragon Ball. As I'll get into later, Akira Toriyama did cause massive waves in the whole industry. I don't want to downplay that for even a moment, considering that his work could be described as the closest anime will ever get to a second Tezuka. But like all art, Dragon Ball leaned on many series that had come before in direct and indirect ways. I think acknowledging both what happened before and after Dragon Ball only enhances appreciation for not only Toriyama, but many of the authors who laid the foundation for the medium of manga and the shonen demographic. There were a lot of Jump titles that started and ended before the first chapter of Dragon Ball was ever conceived. As someone who loves Jump, manga, and just storytelling in general, I want to at least attempt to shine a spotlight on series few have tried, as well as give a general idea of the history of Jump in relation to the specific sorts of manga Dragon Ball is discussed with, battle shonen. There's always a part of me that just gets this itch whenever people forget to consider just how much we didn't receive here in the West, and start talking in absolutes about what Dragon Ball, or the later Big Three, did that others didn't. There's mountains of influential anime and manga that were simply never translated and brought to Western audiences, either for fear it wouldn't suit a Westerner's taste, licensing complications, too old to be relevant when anime got popular globally, long as fuck, so even if it do well, it's simply too big of an investment, or many more reasons that we simply couldn't conceive. We forever have to keep in mind that when getting media from another culture, one whose language we simply do not speak, we're never going to get the full picture. I would even take a more extreme stance and say even if someone snapped their fingers and instantly translated every series ever, we still wouldn't know everything. The perception of media is largely influenced by the time period. If someone were to have experienced new iterations of a particular trope or genre numerous times over before seeing the progenitor of said trope or genre influencer, the hypothetical original could lose much of its impact it would have had during serialization. Obviously this isn't always the case, but for plenty of series and certain kinds of people, it would be. Furthermore, not participating in the culture of the people who made the media similarly affects the ability one would have to judge its impact to the fullest extent. And I really want to stress this point. In the modern day, this dilemma is much less of an issue due to official translation and social media helping to bridge the gap between cultures, but by no means has this issue disappeared. Newer, ongoing, or recently concluded manga can still slip through the cracks. In the mind of those like me who watch or read fan translations that are really well done and indistinguishable from official translation, it can be easy to forget that titles like Hajime no Ippo, Chihaya Furu, or Kingdom aren't considered widely available, at least their manga specifically, which is still kind of insane for the battle junkies out there, which I intend this very video to cater to, but I welcome anyone else as well. Kingdom year after year is in the top 10 best-selling manga. Most of the people who love series like JJK or Demon Slayer would love Kingdom, but due to its lack of availability and the anime adaptation not being terrible or unwatchable, just sort of lacking, considering how gorgeous the manga is, has kneecapped the series from being even half as popular as it is in Japan. The perception of Dragon Ball, for all intents and purposes, has lost some of its cultural context. In the wake of this, there's simply a lot of misinformation and faulty perceptions surrounding the series. The worst offenders literally see Dragon Ball as the father of anime. And no, I'm not kidding, I've heard the exact phrase, Dragon Ball is the father of anime. That'd be like if aliens visited Earth, took back a DVD of Seinfeld, and then built their perception of live action sitcoms around it. Ignoring the fact that there's a lineage of sitcoms that shape the show and genre as a whole, this is the effect of a faulty starting point. Doing this is how people used to think the Earth was the center of the universe. I will say, however, this phenomenon isn't entirely the fault of Westerners or anything. It's an unfortunate side effect of the limited pool of anime that aired on Western television, often picked in a way that minimized risk and heavily leaned on not only the shonen demographic, but further narrowed to the action genre, many at the time of course, inspired by Dragon Ball. It's no wonder that someone without the access to the breadth of what anime can offer, outside of one genre, one demographic, and getting into anime at that particular time would see Dragon Ball as representative of the entire medium. As I said before, I'm assuming it's common knowledge to anyone online watching this sort of video that Dragon Ball isn't anywhere near old enough to have birthed anime. But even for that more informed audience, some may not know that within the magazine the series originates from, it wouldn't even be among the first generation of titles in that. Technically, there are no consistent names for time periods, or generations as many fans like to put it, within Shounen Jump, aside from just one, which is the Golden Age of Jump, reserved for the time in which Fist of the North Star, Dragon Ball, Yu Yu Hakusho, Slam Dunk, and Rurouni Kenshin started publication, which would imply there's at least one before and after. Considering in Japan, there was a colloquial name that became widely accepted among Jump fans to mark a shift in what Jump was putting out at the time. And of course, there's an after because it's not still said that we're in the Golden Age. There's been multiple times where the magazine's biggest titles have ended and new ones needed to take their place, to become the dominant sellers and influencers on future titles. For the purposes of this video, I'm going to borrow from the groundwork laid by George Horvath in his blog, The Land of Obscussion. As far as English speakers go, his blog contains one of the most complete overviews on major Jump titles, many of which the West hasn't been privy to because of the lack of official and unofficial translation. Within the blog, George Horvath proposes his own categorization of Jump's phases using the ages of man, much like that Golden Age name that caught on in Japan. While well argued, and I personally agree with those naming conventions not only making the most sense, but are far better than what most come up with, I'll be shying away from that. I'm simply using the timeline George lays out for everything before Golden Age, as the backbone for my own look at the battle manga that shaped Shonen Jump. However, I still recommend checking out his blog if you're interested in his views on not only the titles I talk about, but titles I won't be mentioning. His look at Jump is about far more than the battle series. It's a sincere attempt at giving every story we can learn about even a little bit of its time in the spotlight, which I think is quite admirable. With that being said, let's get into the start of Shonen Jump. It was 1968, when publisher Shueisha decided to end a manga magazine they'd been publishing known as Shonen Book. Shonen Book had an 11-year stint before coming to an end, supposedly after not quite catching on to the extent of which they'd hoped, given that in the same year, they would start a new magazine, titled Shounen Jump, with the intent of directly challenging the two top shonen magazines at the time, which were Kodansha's Weekly Shonen Magazine and Shokugan's Weekly Shonen Sunday. While at first, Shonen Jump was bi-weekly, they quickly switched to being weekly, and hence went by Weekly Shonen Jump. They debuted with short manga and one-shots, like the very first Jump series, Kujira Daigo, which lasted for 2 volumes. At the start, Jump didn't quite have the solidified identity it does now, perhaps best shown and its foray into dirty comedies, like Harnichi Gakuen, the highly controversial yet nonetheless early staple of Jump. Despite leaving a mark on the industry with its practically unheard of degeneracy and perversity, inspiring fanservice to become a large part of the medium, Otoko Ippiki Gaki Daisho, or the ideal boys gang leader, would be considered Jump's first big hit, and easily one of the magazine's most influential titles. Assistants of the series would go on to create other popular titles, like Fist of the North Star, Golden Boy, and Ginga Nagareboshi Gin. Many accomplished authors got into manga specifically because of Gaki Daisho, like Masami Kuramada, creator of both Ring ni Kakero and Saint Seiya, who in his own right is just as influential, if not more so. Gaki Daisho may have also played a hand in changing the direction of Kinnikuman, from gag to flashy action manga, since the duo behind the series were fans and friends with the creator of Gaki Daisho. In other words, literally every single major battle manga that started before Dragon Ball was directly shaped by Otoko Ippiki Gaki Daisho. If there's just a few titles I want to be kept in mind as this video goes along, it'd be Otoko Ippiki Gaki Daisho, Ring ni Kakero, Kinnikuman, and Fist of the North Star. As far as battle manga before Dragon Ball, these four are the most pivotal. Gaki Daisho in many ways has all of the DNA of what makes shonen battle manga so appealing. While at the time of this writing, the series hasn't been fully translated just yet, the 7 volumes I've read had so much that reminded me of titles that came way later. Otoko Ippiki Gaki Daisho follows Mankichi Togawa, a delinquent who aims to become the toughest man in all of Japan, and later on, to unite Japan under his leadership. Throughout the series, Mankichi constantly rethinks the true path he must take to reach his goal, and what being a man actually is. A lot of what surprised me about the series was the consideration it had for a series made in the late 60s, early 70s on the topic of manhood. While certainly not perfect, with its viewpoint on being a man as no series from several decades ago could really achieve, there's some really great moments born from Mankichi's failures and attempts to become a better, more worthy man. At first, he has a generally simplistic idea of men being people who shouldn't cry, not lose in fights, not like girls, and just generally places most of his emphasis on physical strength. But after losing, being put in situations where strength alone isn't enough, and having to compromise, most of his viewpoints get challenged at one point or another. Mankichi starts to see the reckless way in which he and others engage in fighting won't actually get him to where he wants to go. He needs to form plans, see when some battles aren't actually necessary, respect the strength of others, and even decide when he's not ready to challenge someone above him. The journey the manga depicts is centered around Mankichi's personal growth. What he's lacking at the current moment is the driving force for where he goes next, like staying in Tokyo to find something more in life to value, experiencing homelessness so he knows what it's like to cast aside vanity, and even going to jail to learn a surprising story of a man even greater than him. There's consistently a clear life lesson for Mankichi to grasp, which leads into a point the manga makes about his greatest strength not lying in being physically the strongest, but his strength of will, his inability to give up. That's what makes people want to follow him and become his lackeys. I don't think it's always done perfectly, since it's not the easiest to write convincing reasons for hundreds of people to want to follow one high school aged kid who isn't in a world with superpowers or where children actually have similar status to adults, but nonetheless, the series' greatest strength lies here. Most of the memorable moments so far have been from what Mankichi does to grab the attention of others, as the scale of the series keeps increasing. In the beginning, all the story is concerned with is just the village of Sakai, so understandably, Mankichi's actions don't reach too far outside of that space. But once Mankichi goes up to the larger Tokyo, the series only gets bigger from there, since Mankichi has to constantly one-up himself for more of society to recognize him, and in turn, want to back him. His followers are also given the respect they deserve, as it's been made clear that Mankichi couldn't accomplish great things without their help. One of the bigger misconceptions made by detractors of battle series is just power-ups or simple fighting being solutions to issues, but even Jump's first battle manga doesn't do that. Mankichi's words and actions outside of battle are a key factor in what makes people want to follow him. It can't be understated how important that is, because the series builds itself around Mankichi continually accumulating more men into his family. Even a series with no direct connection to Gaki Daisho, like Naruto, has its protagonist become better with his words, because ultimately that's just as, if not more important than his actual strength. In the short term, both protagonists can make progress by obtaining just strength, but that can only go so far. If they disregard the people around them and stop learning from other perspectives, then their actual goals would be locked off to them. They even both have the trope of one of their earliest supporters being a little kid who deeply respects them, even if there's stronger, more accomplished people out there that they could be looking toward for inspiration. One of the earlier realizations of Mankichi, and something he never stopped struggling with, is the role fighting plays in his life. The way the series tackles it reminded me of Yu Yu Hakusho. Mankichi is constantly ensnared in fighting, as it's really the only thing he can do at first, and the main way he defines himself. A lot of the other delinquents around him similarly derive their own value from physical abilities. But after the priest of Sakai village forces him to question if just being willing to fight is all there is to a man's courage, he starts breaking down, stating how he's no different from a wild dog when fighting is the only thing he's good for. There's something really interesting about how conflict looms over Mankichi. On the one hand, he clearly enjoys fighting. Even after his attempt to give up fighting entirely, he just gets dragged into doing it again and again, not even continuing to loathe the idea of battle. At certain points, his hot-headedness will start unnecessary fights, even when previously he'd avoid meaningless fights or allow himself to be beaten if it was important to do so. Yusuke does the same thing at certain points, like having a huge revelation during the Toguro fight about not throwing away everything for the sake of fighting, only for Sensui to drag that uglier side of himself back out in the very next arc, where he briefly puts the world at stake so he can be the one to defeat Sensui, rather than accepting Koenma's aid. Like Yusuke, however, it seems Otoko Ippiki Gaki Daisho wants Mankichi to reach some sort of middle ground, as not only does he take more responsibility for where his fighting will lead him, but he finds alternatives, like the adult way of fighting, which in the story is money and stocks. Even though Mankichi still fights, he begins to focus on earning money, and trying to invest in another company to challenge an old lady who uses her influence and ability to take over other companies to hurt people close to him, leading to an arc genuinely unlike anything I've ever seen in another battle shonen. I'm not going to pretend the series gets deep into how stocks work, and it obviously bypasses the time it would take to pull off making big money as a high school dropout, but there's some interesting stuff here that I don't want to spoil within the arc. I would genuinely recommend trying the series out, because it's an example of an older manga really holding up, and not quite feeling its age as you read through it. Gaki Daisho shares the aesthetic and tropes of older manga, which can be refreshing in its own way for people who haven't tried that yet, but still having a core that's similar to what most shonen fans are used to. Mankichi's goal is basically being the best leader, which is something many associate with battle series, where decently often the protagonist either wants to be the greatest leader, the strongest, or just the best at blank thing. He's also part of that pipeline of bratty children who are shunned by his community, but later becomes the hero of said community. The series also has a sense of empathy and understanding that is synonymous with shonen. Plenty of enemies to friends, a tendency to reject selfishness, and carrying on from the lessons of predecessors. If I had to pin down Mankichi for people who have yet to read the series, which I'm sure that's most people watching, he's sort of like Yusuke, with a few traits of Naruto mixed in there. Don't get me wrong though, there's more to Mankichi than those two. but you're gonna have to read the series if you're interested in seeing those things. Even though Shounen Jump didn't have its motto of friendship, effort, victory when Gaki Daisho came out, this series definitely set the blueprint. Monkichi had an extreme dedication to his friends, to the point where he laid his life on the line for them numerous times, and it's only through their joint efforts that he achieves victory. Especially the way in which some of his men have their own roles, like strategist or right-hand man. It's no wonder to me that many were attached to Gaki Daisho to make it Jump's first big hit, and the first to get an anime adaptation in the magazine. But to really get a grasp of Gaki Daisho's importance for Jump battle manga, we need to look at the next in the 4 before Dragon Ball to understand that. However, we're gonna have a slight detour. I could simply go back and forth with Otoko Ippiki Gaki Daisho, Ring ni Kakero, Kinnikuman, and Fist of the North Star, but when it comes to the growth of a medium, or the lineage of a magazine, or anime studio, or what have you, there's so much in between the biggest series that tells an important story on why something is the way it is today. So we're actually going to talk about a story that isn't one of those 4, Astro Kyuudan. Astro Kyuudan is a baseball manga, which may seem like an unnecessary series to mention when I already made it clear I'm going to focus on battle series within this video. But when it comes to sports and action, the two genres often cross paths more than some would assume. Tropes and even general storytelling structure can often be similar between the two, not to mention the series that count as both. More importantly, the two genres directly borrow ideas from each other, perhaps most commonly seen in the constant use of the tournament arc. Astro Kyuudan is one of those series that influence both battle manga and sports with its insane escalation. What many love about Jump's battle manga was first done by this series. Before Astro Kyuudan hit the scene, there were other baseball manga in the magazine that relied on traditional tried and true storytelling tropes. One of them, Chichi no Tamashi, was even the very first long-running series in the magazine. Astro Kyuudan, on the other hand, stood out for being the complete opposite of those that had come before, opting to take baseball and make it a game that puts the lives of its players at stake, because the games got so intense that people literally died. Rather than attempting to have somewhat realistic baseball, Astro Kyuudan created a story that could only happen in the world of manga. The players within the setting were literally supermen born with ball-shaped birthmarks, who face their opponents in life or death games that are more akin to battle than mere sport. It seemed no strategy was off the table, as players would even purposely allow their bats to crack when hitting a ball, so the shards would fly alongside it to confuse the opponents. Hits were so powerful that the imagery compared them to nebulae, and many catches had players jumping 10 to 20 meters. No matter the situation, players would continue games till the end, or until they are physically unable to. Vomiting blood? Continue. Having a mental breakdown? Continue, pussy. Power escalation is a term a lot of shonen fans like to use in regards to works classified as battle shonen. But this series quite literally did that before all the anime and manga people apply such a label to. It was to the point that the feats and plot points got so insane that the original writer, Shiro Tozaki, left the series before it was concluded, because he couldn't handle the constant escalation, leading to an editor becoming the writer for the rest of the series. In its run of 183 chapters, there were quite a few firsts for the then relatively young Weekly Jump magazine. The level of exaggeration on display isn't something you would find in other series, which eventually bled into other manga. Nowadays, it's pretty normal for us to see a martial arts monkey boy progress from breaking big rocks to being able to break the biggest spinning rock if he so desired, but this series sowed the seeds for that. Another first for Jump was when the series switched writers. Him and the artist decided to rely on reader surveys for guidance, which is later cited as the origin of creating manga for Weekly Jump. In those two ways, Astro Kyuudan established things that Jump is known for, but unfortunately solemnly gets credit for, especially in regards to the superhuman feats that Western audiences assumed Dragon Ball was the first to do. In reality, those feats would continue to be refined even more before they would reach the likes of Dragon Ball, in the form of Ringi Kakero. Gaki Daisho was big in the early days. Some could even say it was Dragon Ball or One Piece for people who now have arthritis and dementia. For many years, the series featured as the main pull for new readers to buy Jump, and once it really hit its stride, the magazine put it on the cover in a lead position about as much as they do One Piece nowadays. Gaki Daisho was even the first title to be infamously forced to continue, not once, but twice. An editor for the series went as far as literally using whiteout to block out the kanji for the end on the first chapter that was supposed to conclude the series, which is really saying something considering how much bigger Ringi Kakero would become. This series is an utter classic in Japan, and Jump owes its current popularity directly to Kurumada, as it was Ringi Kakero that brought the readership of the magazine to over 3 million. While not the peak it would eventually reach in the golden age, that's still an insane number for a single manga to get the majority of credit for achieving as Jump's first mega hit. In contrast, the golden age is viewed as the combined efforts of 4 or 5 manga. 3 million is roughly the readership Jump gets in current day as a magazine, so you know Ringi Kakero was cooking to get it back then. The amount of money Ringi Kakero brought was so notable that Shueisha could renovate their building and make it bigger, at least according to a rumor Kurumada had heard, as well as employees referring to the building as the Ringi Kake building or Kurumada building. Ringi Kakero was even the first Jump title to earn an all-color lead final chapter ending, meaning not only was the chapter in color, but was placed as the first chapter you'd read in the magazine when opening it. To this day, that's been kept exclusive to only a few manga, those being Ringi Kakero, Dragon Ball, Slam Dunk, Naruto, and Kochikame. Historically, Jump has been pretty stingy toward titles that came to an end, even during the golden age. Stuff like Yu Yu Hakusho was stuffed almost in the back of the magazine for the last chapter, since the series ending was unlikely to attract new readers and in fact could do the opposite. It wouldn't be around the Silver Age that Jump would regularly start giving manga some attention for their conclusion, with many getting center color, meaning a colored final chapter in the middle of the magazine. Some examples of series you may or may not be familiar with getting this treatment would be Sket Dance, Reborn, Bakuman, Bleach, or Nisekoi. Ringi Kakero, on the other hand, was such a big deal that the then shittier Jump wouldn't dare disrespect it, and even now, gives the series its just dues. In 2014, Ringi Kakero was named by Shueisha the hot-blooded fighting manga bible, and to this day, is considered the standard on how to handle action series. Akira Toriyama himself is a devout follower of that scripture, and one of the most iconic instances of that Bible being put into practice. In 1982, Toriyama wrote a letter to Kurumada, which was included in the original print of the series in the 23rd volume of Ringi Kakero, where he details learning about the series when asking an editor what the most popular Jump series is. After being told that Ringi Kakero was by far the most popular series, he felt inspired when he learned of the intense action and masculinity of the manga, saying how he wanted to copy that form of drawing, but at the time didn't see himself as capable of matching even 1/100th of that intensity. He also expressed a desire to introduce a character similar to Genzaki from Ringi Kakero into his manga, ultimately calling Kurumada incredible and asking him to continue publishing manga. I don't like being one of those people who say X wouldn't exist without blank thing, because we don't exist in a world where X didn't happen. But no matter how you read this letter, Ringi Kakero played a hand in the creation of Dragon Ball. For those who are unfamiliar with Ring ni Kakero, you may be wondering at this point what's so special about it, especially when most Western anime fans have no idea of its existence. Well, as usual, Ring ni Kakero isn't a wholly original story. Whether it be Gaki Daisho, Dragon Ball, or anything else for that matter, no series can be said to 100% come up with something, as everything ultimately builds on what was done before it. Storytelling is just one big passing of the torch, and what makes a series unique is its different assortment of inspirations filtered through the head of its writer, of which Ring ni Kakero had many, but Ring ni Kakero is still special, and as far as Jump manga is concerned, handled its story in ways more similar to what we have now. Ring ni Kakero follows Ryuji and Kiku, the children of deceased professional boxer who was nearly a world champion before his untimely death, which makes Kiku train Ryuji in order to realize that dream. However, Ryuji doesn't like boxing, at least initially. To most, Ryuji is just a crybaby with absolutely no similarities to his father, but eventually that changes when Ryuji meets Kenzaki, a boxing prodigy his age who trounces him upon their first meeting and bullies him afterwards. After being bullied, reflecting on the rough life he and his sister have had up to that point, and accepting boxing as the path he must take to live a life with meaning, he decides to get stronger. Over time, he learned to love the sport and formed a genuine rivalry with Kenzaki. At first, Ring ni Kakero started in a simple manner. Kurumada took a lot from Shonen magazine's Ashina no Joe, because R&K was meant to be a homage to it. So early on, the similarities were far more evident, but over time, those would become less obvious. Kurumada felt he wouldn't be able to outdo Joe, so he might as well do something different, which is why he decided to implement some of Astro Kyuudan's style. Punches could cut shirts or skin, open holes in sandbags, scar surfaces from sheer heat of movement, launch opponents in the air, leave craters in walls, or be so fast that people who aren't one of the fighters literally can't see them. Reminds me of another series. Furthermore, each character got a super blow, which was displayed with special effects. Ring ni Kakero didn't just blindly use its exaggeration in exactly the same manner as Astro Kyuudan though, since the series still had punches that were able to be performed in real life, and actually follow the rules of boxing, for the most part. Astro Kyuudan freely broke the rules of boxing, and at times, didn't resemble the sport. Super blows, on the other hand, were ultimately still classified as one of boxing's actual punches. Right straight, left straight, uppercut, etc. Due to Kurumada lifting this aspect from Astro Kyuudan, this way of showcasing action became popularized, and manga both inside of Jump and out wouldn't stop doing this since, like Kinnikuman becoming hyper-exaggerated wrestling, and Captain Tsubasa giving extra flair to the character's kicks. Tournaments were also given a new twist that hadn't been common within action series at the time, which was making some of them more team-focused. Ryuji eventually joins a team to represent Japan as a whole, and fights alongside previous rivals. Rather than all the focus being on the individual fighting for his victory, the overall team winning was most important. For example, when Krillin beat Chaozu in Dragon Ball, it was a W for the whole Turtle School. Or when Yamcha lost to Tien, it was a blow to the entire team. In arcs like that, it ultimately doesn't matter who beats the big bad, as long as someone on the team does. More often than not, it just happens to be the protagonist for thematic reasons. Another mainstay in shonen battle manga after Ring ni Kakero was the classic rescue arc. Kiku, Ryuji's sister, wound up being taken by the Shadow Clan, so we follow our protagonist fighting his way up a tower to get to her. Kurumada had gotten this from a Bruce Lee film, and now it almost feels like a rite of passage to have a rescue arc of some sort in your series. Hell, some series have multiple of them. Finally, the cast of characters seemed to stand out a bit more than usual, especially the multiple rivalries, varied antagonists, and really giving audiences multiple people to root for. Ryuji and Kenzaki's dynamic is probably as classic as you can get when it comes to Jump rivalries, especially when it comes to those that start off as straight up enemies. Ryuji and Kenzaki competing, but also helping each other when necessary, is something that's relevant to the whole story. It's quite possible for some audiences to not necessarily root for Ryuji because they like who Kenzaki becomes. Similar to what Dragon Ball fans feel for Vegeta, Kenzaki even starts fucking the main heroine. Goat copies goat. Ring Kakero accomplished a tremendous amount in its 18-volume run, and is a series that any hardcore Jump fan should at least attempt to get into. Like many old Jump series, however, the manga isn't fully translated, at least in English, unless you speak Spanish, French, or of course Japanese. And unlike Gaki Daisho, which I feel has a solid amount out to really see the highs of the series, as well as get a grasp of the core of the story, Ring Kakero's translation stops when things were really getting going in its first tournament. So those of us who only speak English are pretty out of luck in just how much we can ascertain about the legacy of the series. An anime adaptation of Ring Kakero exists and is translated, but personally, I think it's a mixed bag of an adaptation. Not only does it skip the beginning of the story, where you get the backstory of why Ryuji and Kiku are out in Tokyo on their own, trying to make it in the world of boxing, but you don't get the buildup of Ryuji being a coward who grows into the soaring dragon, nor do you get Kenzaki when he was actually antagonistic. Instead, the anime chooses to start in the middle of Ryuji and Kenzaki's third fight. There are a few sparse flashbacks crammed into episode 1, with the characters vaguely recalling past events, but they go by quickly and don't sufficiently get across what happened in a clear manner, without having read those things in the manga. Could you imagine the adaptation of Dragon Ball deciding not to show Vegeta as an antagonist, or Naruto just starting when Sasuke already went to Orochimaru? Both of those characters would be demonstrably weaker. Even as someone who read what they could of the manga, it was hard to tell what was even going on, and I certainly wasn't invested in a fight I was dropped into midway through. Not to mention, I don't think the show looks that good in a more general sense. Movement was really stiff, and the repeated animation was more noticeable in a bad way, even by standards of the time. Like, Hajime no Ippo was right there, and going on for 4 years before Ring Kakero received its first adaptation. A possible explanation for why the series doesn't adapt the early material is because it was aimed at those who already read the manga in Japan, rather than those experiencing it for the first time in anime form. And the sequel manga Ring Kakero 2 was already publishing, so the anime for the original decided to skip to the really good shit, to act as a pseudo advertisement for the sequel series. Nonetheless, I'd implore you to not simply take my word in regards to the quality of the adaptation, if you're interested in giving the series a try. The later seasons seem to improve visually, and even the early material you might end up liking even if I wasn't a fan. And it's not like there's a whole lot of options to go through Ring Kakero until a fan group finishes translating the manga. Something is probably better than nothing, especially for one of Jump's most important manga. Thankfully for the rest of Jump's biggest battle shonen, they are able to be read in their entirety, or mostly watched if that's your prerogative. The next one even aired on Western television at one point. Kinnikuman, in my humble opinion, is about as far back as you can go in Jump's history of battle series, where it's a bit easier to stumble across those who are aware of it. You're never gonna find an anime fan on the streets gassing up Kinnikuman or dripped out in Kinnikuman swag, but it's had a slow rise in recognition within select pockets of shonen fans online. If an aspiring shonen expert talks about the history of battle series, you might actually hear them bring up Kinnikuman, even if only for a brief moment. Alternatively, if said person fails to mention Kinnikuman to an audience of a decent size, there could be a person or two who swoops in to say, "What about Kinnikuman?" Kinnikuman is definitely the point where if you want to do your homework, it's fairly accessible, even if scans of the manga can be pretty rough at points. People call Dragon Ball the father or grandfather of Battle Shonen, but Kinnikuman in the more die-hard circles is seen as the series that should truly have that moniker. While that ignores Gaki Daisho and Ring ni Kakero still, I'd actually say Kinnikuman still deserves that title. Gaki Daisho and Ring ni Kakero are more like great-grandfathers, whose legacy is certainly still felt and worth knowing about, but their time is over. Kinnikuman is the grandfather that's still with us to this day, and active as a franchise. Most recently, it was announced that Kinnikuman would be getting another anime adaptation, but even before that, we've been getting new chapters of the series since 2011. After the original Kinnikuman ended in 87, a sequel series following the son of Suguru Kinniku, better known as Kinnikuman, started in 1998. That was known as Kinnikuman 2, Nisei, or Ultimate Muscle. Think of it as a Boruto type of series. We follow the main cast's kids, but the parents are still around and occasionally show up to kick some ass. Which, interestingly enough, is the series that actually aired here in the West.
Just be incredible,
Unforgettable. Totally unwettable.
miss your cheeks.
Watch for Ultimate Muscle's wackiest star hosting the Fox Box later this month.
Why? Why not?
Likely in part due to some dated racial or religious depictions within the original, and minor copyright issues that could have been had in Kinnikuman's earlier parody content. Not to mention, Ultimate Muscle was the newer adaptation that had already started before it was decided Kinnikuman should air on Western television. As a quick aside, Ultimate Muscle wasn't the absolute first introduction the series had in the West, as Kinnikuman was actually brought over in the form of merchandise, a toy line distributed by Mattel, and one Bandai Namco NES video game. While not advertised as from an anime series, opting instead to brand the series as just Muscle, it's worth mentioning, since it factors into why the anime could have gotten the name Ultimate Muscle in the West, to align with the products we'd already been getting. After the conclusion of Ultimate Muscle, the original Kinnikuman came back after 22 years, in 2011, or 4 years after Nisei ended in 2007. Think of that as the Dragon Ball Super to Kinnikuman, only difference being that Kinnikuman kept the title as simply Kinnikuman, and continued the volume count rather than resetting it. Unfortunately, I'm not reading all that shit. My apologies to the Kinnikuman Community Club. I will read it all one day. However, I did read all of the original run, which is what's relevant to the legacy the series would leave behind for Jump, and is part of the series that was running before Dragon Ball. Kinnikuman is an important step in the evolution of battle manga, as well as the series you could more directly point to as very clearly having done many things prior to Akira Toriyama's Dragon Ball. When I read through Kinnikuman, it felt like even if the series didn't manage to tackle an idea in the most interesting way, in comparison to what later series would iterate on, there was just a constant point added to the scoreboard of things Kinnikuman touched on before most of the series were familiar with, to the point that it'd be monotonous for me to try mentioning every single one of them. However, I'm gonna try my best to mention the most major ways Kinnikuman changed the landscape of Battle Shonen. One way Kinnikuman changed everything was simply through its humble beginnings as a gag series. Originally meant to parody the live-action tokusatsu franchise Ultraman. This video is already long as is, so I don't need to sit here and describe the larger picture of what Toku is, as many have done before me, but the long and short of it, Toku is Japanese live-action TV or film that places a strong emphasis on the use of special effects. Tokusatsu is very important to the DNA of anime, as it contains a lot of the same tropes, just within a live-action setting. Many Toku inspired different aspects of anime, and vice versa. TLDR, Toku is neat. It's like live-action anime except without the baggage of adapting something made for animation, so they tend to be more consistently good. Anyway, the basis of Kinnikuman at first was essentially what if Ultraman were an incompetent fool who can barely defeat kaiju. Before the series' actual publication, the one-shot took this concept more literally, with Kinnikuman being a long-lost Ultra Brother, who isn't considered part of the family because he's such a loser. However, when the series actually began properly, this was obviously no longer the case, because they can't just blatantly use a copyrighted character in official material. So this element of the series was an obvious nod to Ultraman without being explicitly connected. During the early stretch of Kinnikuman, it utilized the Monster of the Week formula for a good chunk of chapters. Often the point wasn't the eventual overcoming of said monster, but using that as a backbone to a joke in regards to how incompetent Kinnikuman is. Whether it be him losing, needing to get bailed out by another character, or winning entirely due to luck. These chapters showed how Kinnikuman is not only shunned by the public at large, but in certain ways deservingly so. Kinnikuman initially cares a lot about fame, no doubt perpetuated by being the butt of every joke, but nevertheless, engages in some unheroic actions to change his reputation. Like chapter 2, where Kinnikuman decides to get a kaiju to pretend to attack a girl, so he can show off his strength by saving her then stealing a kiss. So it makes sense the chapter punishes him for his less than noble actions. Even though the kaiju ends up fighting back for real, since losing to Kinnikuman in front of a cute girl would look lame, Kinnikuman is still at fault for making him threaten an innocent woman in the first place. So in spite of Kinnikuman's rare victory, a man who is her childhood friend and manager ends up being mistaken for the person who beat the monster, with Kinnikuman left crying in the background. Not all of the chapters in this gag-oriented portion of the series are like this though. There's a gradual change where some chapters end on a wholesome note, or have Kinnikuman actually do something admirable. One chapter that stood out to me was an instance of Kinnikuman genuinely defeating a kaiju, but it cries and gets bullied by regular citizens for being weak, so Kinnikuman sacrifices the momentary support he got after defeating it to defend him, believing the citizens went too far, and he too has similarly been a victim of being looked down upon simply for being weak. Eventually though, the series would move past this familiar structure of silly humor meant to demean its protagonist, as Kinnikuman learns of his off-world heritage. Kinnikuman as a child was mistakenly thrown off of a ship after being confused for a pig since he was the uglier of the two, while the real pig was raised in his place. After he's told about being the rightful prince and eventual king of planet Kinniku, as well as his real name of Suguru Kinniku, the series utilizes this as one of the tools at its disposal to push its serious arcs, since the Kinniku are among the strongest of the fictional Chojin race. It's specifically within the third volume that Kinnikuman decides to make a shift toward becoming a battle manga, even deciding to use tournaments as the basis for its more serious tone going forward, much like what Dragon Ball would do later on. Yoshihiro Togashi even cited Kinnikuman as the inspiration for the way he began Yu Yu Hakusho. Rather than get right into being a full-blown action series, he wanted to depict a series of heartfelt stories, so readers can get a grasp of the characters before they're thrown into tense situations. It should be noted that the anime cuts some of these out, but the manga has quite a bit more. While not the gag to battle pipeline per se, the transitional aspect is at its core the same. This sort of storytelling is starting to change with the newest Jump titles that are running shorter and going for a faster pace, but if you've experienced even a few older titles, then you're likely to have seen this in other stories. Hidekyo Hitman Reborn has almost 60 chapters of gags before becoming the stylish mafia battle series it's known for being. Bleach, despite still being an action series, lets its earlier content have short stories, focused on down-to-earth heartfelt premises, with a dash of lighthearted comedy, before raising the stakes with epic clashes of ideals that decide the fate of realms. Uda Damago, as the duo behind Kinnikuman are known as, changed the direction of Kinnikuman to battle due to the overwhelming success of Rini Kakero, likely seeing flashy action as suitable to the manga they'd already been making, which resulted in what's perhaps Jump's most iconic shift. While Dragon Ball did change quite a bit from chapter 1 to the end, I'd argue the change was more gradual than some give it credit for, and Toriyama already went into Dragon Ball knowing he wanted to do an action series, since he grew tired of Dr. Slump and wanted to change things up, whereas Uda Damago didn't go into Kinnikuman knowing they wanted to move past being a gag series, but still pulled it off anyway. arguably in a way that's more shocking than some would have expected for what the series started off as. The violence in Kinnikuman's manga is more than even the average battle shonen we get nowadays. Of course there are exceptions, but it's kind of rare for a series that isn't marketed as a more mature battle shonen. Limbs are frequently torn off, characters often stabbed, blood gushing, and character deaths are numerous, even if they're often reversed. Kinnikuman pulls no punches in showing just how bloody conflicts can be, since many confrontations are set up to be death matches, with unique stages or character powers that get more brutal as the series progresses. Hell, characters at times literally just get torn in half. Despite this, Kinnikuman in the first tournament specifically retains the same sort of comedy that was synonymous with the earlier portion of the story, like many gag to battle shonen tend to. Especially given the incredible amounts of luck Suguru still needs to win contests or beat his opponents. He literally shits his pants when fighting Ramen Man, which allows him to escape a deadly hold, though the difference that the series starts to make apparent is that Suguru is not only more willing to fight, but starts utilizing his luck more actively, so the wins start feeling a bit more earned, like his quick thinking to turn his rebound off the ropes into a counterattack, rather than helplessly hurling back into the opponent. The only exception to Suguru's luck carrying is really just the final Robin Mask fight. Suguru is able to withstand a finishing move and beat Robin Mask due to Terryman telling him to look for a psychological weakness rather than a physical one from a seemingly perfect opponent, which starts the trend where Suguru's wins become more legitimate, and any help he ends up receiving leans more on the friendships and mentors he's had along the way. The shift is a bit gradual at first, but eventually, Suguru is just a strong Chojin, with no ifs, ands, or buts about it, even if a lot of people still think he's an idiot. I'd say he's more or less on par with the standard shonen action hero. In terms of their strength in comparison to their setting, Suguru basically ends up as the strongest on his side, but obviously still needs help against the villains that up the ante with every new antagonist. Gaki Daisho within the story places emphasis on camaraderie and mentorships, so does Ringi Kakero, but Kinnikuman undeniably codified it in a way that's inextricably linked to Jump magazine. If we're being honest, the vast majority of stories with a positive message contain friendship. It's not a unique idea to Jump or manga/anime as a whole, but the exaggerated way of showcasing it is what inspired Jump to encourage other manga in its magazine to do the same, and is the true inspiration for the motto Jump would carry into the modern day, of friendship, effort, victory. After having read Kinnikuman, it's not surprising to me that this specific series is what kickstarted that trend. In Kinnikuman, friends and mentors serve as a more direct source of power for characters, allowing them to get back up or have a sudden burst of strength in a far more out there way than what older manga would do. Hell, Kinnikuman as the series that popularized the trope to the extent we see it now happens to be far more literal and exaggerated than any other manga I've ever read. In a derogatory way, some people will complain about the power of friendship, winning conflicts in certain stories, but Chad Kinnikuman literally has the power of friendship as a named source of power for Justice Chojin, where they can honestly do damn near anything as a result of it. Strength and defense become heightened to absurd degrees, characters will die, but due to their bonds can speak to other Chojin from the afterlife, somehow have their arms magically appear and replace the severed arms of another character, spirits will be able to physically touch people, the clothes of dead Chojin will be able to move from being imbued with friendship, a character's ashes has free will and agency to save characters from death blows, the tears of Justice Chojin and fans summon a rain cloud that's able to revive a character. When characters are made to literally not exist anymore, they can still help Kinnikuman. I guess their bond is strong enough to overcome non-existence. It's honestly difficult to describe just how insane Kinnikuman gets when it comes to this. Every major conflict has some new instance of friendship resulting in a never before seen outcome. Characters after a certain point constantly proclaim things about their friendship, and it gets worked into the lore of the setting in a way that's frankly just insane. Justice Chojin in the olden days, who simply disliked friendship, they didn't necessarily have to be evil, are ironically shunned from their community, and one of the many gods within the setting decided the punishment for these kinds of chojin is to sweat metal for some reason, which is conveniently explained and shown during a fight featuring antagonists with a magnetism power, fighting against two justice chojin who temporarily turn their back on friendship. The friendship angle of Kinnikuman isn't just limited to the chojin as a race, but to their wrestler spirits. Through fighting and recognizing the strength of opponents, even when their goals differ, a respect is eventually formed that turns chojin of all kinds to good. Devil chojin, brutal chojin, yes, there's a distinction, perfect chojin, etc., through the context of competition, allowing a blossoming of respect for one's strength and character. Kinnikuman, more than those before it, became the template on how the enemy to friend trope was handled in Jump titles. Gaki Daisho and reigning Kakero had certainly done a similar thing, but not to the same extent, nor in the exaggerated manner Kinnikuman had done, where everyone, no matter how evil, could make the switch to justice. The explicit goal was a story where all chojin could be friends, and fights would create a newfound friendship. That friendship was so strong that all these chojin were a sort of found family. Kinnikuman managed to take a trope common in wrestling, where characters could come back in completely different roles, and be accepted by the audience all the same. Despite potential contradictions that could arise from said new character, the new lore was worked into the existing story, no matter what, for an interesting twist, or to attempt to solidify a performer for fans of the sport. Kinnikuman being a story in a fictional world upped the ante of that known phenomena, and in the process helped codify the trope from that medium into Jump's battle manga. I'd argue that far before Dragon Ball had the bulk of its main cast be former murderers or genocidal aliens, far before a knuckle-headed ninja found his way and talked no jutsu to his foes, far before a boy's ideals would reach those who seemed unreachable, and far before a simple man of action would force others to see the errors of their ways, Kinnikuman solidified the enemy to friend trope in its most common form, to become an expected and accepted facet of these idealist shonen manga, no matter how extreme it might seem for some foes to change their ways. Not only does no main antagonist fail to return as a good guy in Kinnikuman, at least in the original, but even the most innocuous chojin can have a dramatic turn to good. The ending of the original run specifically calls attention to that facet of the series. Not to spoil too much of the conclusion, but it very much spells out and demonstrates how a lot of future titles handle redemption. Suguru, after having deeply matured at the end of his journey, talks about encountering many different philosophies from all kinds of different chojin, but nonetheless, being able to understand and respect them, because it's through conflict that they can find common ground. Kinnikuman doesn't have awfully complex reasons on why antagonists behave the way they do in comparison to what future titles accomplish, but for what variation there is, Kinnikuman's fights allow contradictions to be slowly exposed over the course of their long battle. My personal favorite was Ashura Man's change from Devil Chojin to Justice Chojin. After having been raised to hate and exploit others for one's own personal gain, he was shown compassion by his mentor, who saved him at the cost of his own life. The Devil Chojin around him would view that as a weakness. It only served to rob him of his life. At the time, he was just an impressionable child. So despite his feelings of gratitude, love, and sadness, he buried all of that to accept what he was told as a fact. Kindness is weak. His mentor gave up his ambitions and died a pointless death. But the reality is that one piece of kindness, whether he acknowledged it or not, stayed with him. So when witnessing the heroism and friendship of Justice Chojin, he couldn't help but think back to that man he owed his life to. They kept getting stronger through caring about each other and covering for the weaknesses of the other. This is bolstered by the fact that this arc is a tag team tournament. To fight as a duo, no matter how much you try to avoid it, you have to work together. Hatred and exploitation don't actually work in this context. To disregard your partner is to willingly handicap yourself. So as Ashura Man and his partner Sunshine fought together, they had to protect each other, just as Justice Chojin did if they had any hopes of winning. Sunshine realized this before Ashura Man. He didn't have the will to deny the power gained through friendship. so he went out of his way to cover for his partner. At first, Ashura Man berated Sunshine for getting soft, as he didn't want to give in to the feelings that lay dormant in his heart. However, through the mutual struggle Sunshine and Ashura Man were going through, of being two stray devil children fighting against seemingly impossible odds, Sunshine in a burst of emotion proclaimed, "Devil children can have friendship too." Despite his best efforts, Ashura Man couldn't deny how deeply touched he was by those words, as no one since his master had cared for him to this extent. Ultimately, he shed tears just as he'd done on the day his master died protecting him. It's through the 4 layers of Tag Team Arc, witnessing the Justice Children's friendship, Sunshine giving in first, and the backstory that this specific fight stands out as being so well done, for having so much there as to why Ashura Man can change over the course of this one fight. And fuck man, I love the way his 3 faces are drawn, with tears and glowing eyes. It's so exaggerated, stupid, and wholesome. It's in that way that Kinnikuman is a clear shift in comparison to the other battle manga we've discussed so far. While Kinnikuman doesn't always land in its attempts to justify a Choujin's turn toward good, God only knows the amount of mid-battle flashbacks that I just couldn't get behind, there's nonetheless a focus on opening the door to anyone willing to change. The emphasis on long drawn out battles having a lot to do with the victory of our main cast, but at times just as much a fight to elicit change within the hearts of the opponents, feels closer to how modern shonen handle that phenomena. Gaki Daisho, for comparison, despite being a story that features a protagonist who brings many to his side, doesn't accomplish that feat within the fights themselves, in the manner most shonen tend to nowadays. Nor with the same tropes of delving into the backstories and ideals of the opponent, like Kinnikuman later on. Rather, the focus in those older titles was the main character showing why he's deserving of respect. Kinnikuman is different for consistently having that other layer, of needing to acknowledge the complexities of the antagonist's specific situation. Furthermore, people end up falling in love with Mankichi as a person, rather than also focusing on exposing contradictions and failings of an ideology. It's still the framework that many after Kinnikuman would use, even as more nuance begins to emerge. Personally speaking, I'm not surprised at all that Kinnikuman cemented the motto into words from this point forward. Suguru especially feels like his character is literally friendship effort victory, whereas Mankichi and Ryuji just happen to retroactively fit into that saying. Moreover, Suguru is the first iconic jump idiot. Of the many manga before Kinnikuman, there were for a fact heroes of a questionable IQ, but none of them were iconic for it like Suguru. In Western anime discussion, Goku is thought of as the face of dumber protagonists, but that isn't entirely true, in the way most commonly assumed. Suguru and Goku's idiocy have a key distinction in that Suguru is genuinely an idiot, like a full-blown dumbass, at least until literally the final arc, whereas Goku is more so just ignorant, in a childish way. Kinnikuman popularized having an idiot protagonist, but Dragon Ball refined that to childish idiocy, or better expressed as childish ignorance, that's become adopted into many more manga. A crude example of difference between Goku and Suguru is that when Goku was a kid, would touch people's private parts to check their sex. For a kid raised in the mountains, away from people, and has only seen one other human being, it's understandable for him to have no concept of male and female, without a consistent exposure to different people. Even actual children confuse boys for girls, or vice versa, in real life. Given the circumstances of Goku obviously not knowing it's a no-no to touch people in their private parts, because he simply wasn't told, it's clever of him to think of that as a way to check when he isn't sure. Not to mention, it doesn't take long for him to stop doing this, because he just learns who is a boy and who is a girl. Whereas Suguru is a full-blown adult and grew up around others, but literally spreads his own dad's ass cheeks open because he thinks a villain is hiding in there. There's no logic on his part as to why he would think this. A villain just disappears while fighting in the ring, and his first thought is to check his dad's ass. And I gotta say, despite Suguru's genuine stupidity and other traits that typically have a negative connotation, like selfishness, cowardice, and being a show-off, the underdog narrative early arcs of the series utilize manages to save him as a character. Personally speaking, I really didn't care about Suguru for quite a bit. He was annoying and criminally unfunny, but after seeing Suguru be brought down over and over by everyone around him, I felt myself rooting him on, because despite his flaws, he always tries when it matters, even if everyone is against him. And weirdly enough, Suguru not entirely growing out of his flaws makes him more likable. There reaches a certain point in the story where Suguru is one of Earth's strongest, but he still retains his same old goofy clumsy self. No matter how much cruelty and violence Suguru faces, it doesn't manage to taint the purity he has deep down inside. Furthermore, no matter how much Suguru wins, I don't think it truly goes to his head as much as it may seem. Once in a while, Suguru's showboating nature will pop up in a similar way to his false confidence early in the story, usually for a gag, but ultimately, Suguru still respects the strength of both his comrades and enemies enough to waver on if he wants to fight. His assessment on the legitimacy of those he faces has become much sharper before needing to exchange a single blow. In arcs where Suguru needs to compete against his friends, even those he's beaten before, he not only takes them seriously, but questions if he can overcome them once more, which is actually something Kinnikuman does quite well, keeping its main cast continually relevant and able to rejoin conflicts. Characters who haven't partaken in a few arcs are able to learn new techniques and get strong enough to compete. My favorite example is Kinnikuman's master Kamehame returning after being gone for several arcs. When Kamehame was introduced, Kinnikuman had made the switch to a battle series, but it was still in its early stages. Aspects of the series weren't all solidified, and minor plot points being dropped with little to no reference later on wasn't uncommon. Kamehame taught Kinnikuman most of his signature moves, but after being gone for over 100 chapters, he didn't seem like that important of a character in the grand scheme of things. Not to mention, they didn't show the training process, or take time to show the growth of a master-student bond. A text bubble explained a week had passed, and suddenly Kinnikuman had 48 new signature moves. As a result, Kamehame was fairly easy to forget about, but his return in the Dream Tag Chojin arc was pivotal to what made that arc work so well. The idea of Kamehame being Suguru's master was truly fleshed out like never before, with more on-screen bonding and battles that showed trust, as well as genuine understanding from the respect both sides have for each other. Suguru from recognizing Kamehame as not only a Chojin with far more experience than him, but always remembering that Kamehame is the only person to beat him in official competition. So Suguru is always humble when speaking to Kamehame. On Kamehame's side, he has respect for Kinnikuman's unending potential and true Chojin spirit. So he treats him not simply as if you're a student, but as an equal. Kamehame donning a Kinniku mask to be Kinnikuman's partner and hide his identity from everyone else, aside from Suguru, instead of anything else he could have done, shows how they both can stand side by side. Kamehame didn't have to use a Kinniku mask. He could have thrown on a brown paper bag and called it a day. Not to mention, that shit is genuinely the hardest Kinnikuman goes in the original run. Kinnikuman's design isn't meant to be particularly cool, but somehow Kamehame having a black mask and a different attitude completely changes how it comes across. Seeing them together in chapter covers just comes across as truly classic. Speaking of classic, Kinnikuman utilizes the truly huge Battle Shonen cast far more than anything before it. There's so much focus on other Chojin and their conflicts that it becomes possible to have plenty of characters to be more invested in if you don't particularly connect to Suguru, which undoubtedly bolstered the popularity of the series. Newer titles relative to Kinnikuman have done a similar tactic to gain momentum with readers. Hideki Sirachi's Gintama was almost axed before its introduction of the Shinsengumi. The new dynamics offered by that large group of fan favorite characters played off of the familiar odd jobs, in a way that quite literally saved the manga. Nowadays, Jump manga that are in danger of getting cancelled, having a decline, or simply want to keep up momentum with readers, similarly keep this as a tool in their arsenal. Kinnikuman even allowed the audience to submit OCs, to have them potentially featured in the story, not just as a one-off character, cameo, or obvious fan art included at the end of a volume, but as legitimate characters that have just as much of a chance at becoming mainstays as someone fully conceptualized by Urudamago themselves. A notable example is Robin Mask. He's one of Kinnikuman's most prominent characters, with the most development in the entire story, going from respected Chojin champion to bitter antagonist, and redeemed into close friend and rival of Suguru. It's in all of these ways that Kinnikuman reminds me of a children's toy box, where anyone from anywhere can fight, team up, work their way into a new role, or just have some kind of weird ass ability. It's like when you're a kid and have a hodgepodge of characters from different series where some are clearly stronger than others, but you're still gonna figure out a reason why they can fight on somewhat even terms, regardless of logical sense. Leonardo from TMNT having a sparring match with Naruto Uzumaki, of course he can somehow use chakra, and has his own Sage Mode-like transformation called Turtle Mode. Zuko from Avatar injecting himself with Saiyan blood, which allows him to utilize Super Saiyan? Why not? I genuinely don't say this to belittle Kinnikuman. I think this creative side of it appeals to the demographic it's aimed toward. And as I mentioned a bit earlier, Kinnikuman is aware of wrestling tropes. As an outsider to wrestling, I'm not going to claim I have a deep understanding of that world, but from the little I've begun to learn about, they lean harder into the sensationalized fiction that is televised wrestling, more than what I used to assume. As one of those dumbass kids who thought wrestling being fake was some closely guarded secret, or that it diminished it as a form of entertainment. Wrestling is fake, scripted as hell, and that's part of the beauty in it. Wrestling on TV has utilized mystical powers, strange origin stories, and shit that has nothing to do with the simple act of fighting. A lot of this, even to actual fans, can be a mixed bag. Some end up as memorable stories that surpass the sum of their parts, and others are what the fuck was that? Kinnikuman harnesses that energy. Not every Chojin feels like they could possibly exist in the same world, yet they somehow do. A toilet man is no less Chojin than those who look like regular people. The unlikely combinations go well into the bit I've looked into of the continuation, where characters who never got the chance to meet, team up, or fight each other now do. As I've been alluding to, Kinnikuman has a lot of nonsense in it. Characters can truly do anything, from simple things like fire or farts as a power in a match, to controlling the environment by switching tapes, or spinning the entire world with magnetism to reverse time. This can be appealing or unappealing depending on who you are, as it can be fun to not know what to expect when the series doesn't limit itself whatsoever, but on the flip side, fights can come across as BS when characters repeatedly reveal some hidden ability that changes the course of the fight. Any story, even exceptional ones, do this to some degree, but if I'm being honest, Kinnikuman can take it too far for my taste. As much as I respect Kinnikuman for what it contributed to stories I love, and I don't want to dissuade anyone from giving the series a shot proper to come to their own conclusion, I'd feel a bit dishonest if I didn't give a warning that Kinnikuman of all the series I mentioned in this video isn't for everyone. From my point of view, even when the story finds its footing as the battle shonen it wants to be, it can be messy and repetitive. As someone who typically enjoys the power of friendship in stories, Kinnikuman got to the point where it rarely did anything for me, because it was not only overused between a lot of characters, who I couldn't buy into the bond between, but had no consistent logic. I'd read a match and just be like, okay? When there's another instance of something coming out of nowhere, whether it be a power or sudden mid-battle flashback, to create a never-before implied relation between two characters. Kinnikuman can be a chore to read, not helped by being surprisingly wordy for a manga that has consistent fights. undoubtedly muddled by an inconsistent translation from some groups doing a better job than others. Nonetheless, what I've seen of Kinnikuman is a truly important manga for the lineage of Jump titles. Where Ringi Kakero left off in adding exaggeration to his battle sequences, with what's quite similar to superpowers, and showing new premises for the structure of arcs, Kinnikuman fully leaned into that exaggeration and became fantasy, cementing the focus on tangible powers, techniques, and being unconcerned with the confines of reality. Otherworld threats and stakes that affect the world at large start to become the norm from Kinnikuman's step into that territory. Even if Dragon Ball's eventual release is what could be considered the final evolution of the action fantasy that battle shonen most often use. Gaki Daisho and Ringi Kakero aren't part of the fantasy genre, but now, when you think about the most popular battle shonen, they're more than likely an action fantasy. However, just because that's where battle shonen settle today, for the most part, that doesn't mean Kinnikuman immediately shifted everything, as it can take time before inspiration has time to influence upcoming artists, or those who aren't going to change their successful, already publishing manga in the midst of Kinnikuman taking off. Fist of the North Star ultimately shows that dichotomy, as a series that serves as a bridge between old and new, yet in what may sound like a contradiction, is simultaneously a branching path all its own. Despite being released just a year before Dragon Ball and prior to the end of Kinnikuman, there remain areas of Fist of the North Star that are far more synonymous with an era Jump would ultimately move past, in comparison to Kinnikuman. Rather than what could be simplified into a straightforward progression from Gaki Daisho to Ringi Kakero to Kinnikuman, Fist of the North Star is a bit harder to see that way. Despite being within the overall DNA helix of Jump battle manga, and having left a mark on the wider medium, Fist of the North Star is the last bastion of a bygone era. For all of its popularity, and being the only series in this video aside from Dragon Ball that I'd hope everyone knows, it's actually surprisingly difficult to attribute much to in terms of Jump's current direction. Fist of the North Star has influenced huge manga like JoJo, Berserk, and Vinland Saga, one of which no longer runs in Jump, and the other two having nothing to do with the magazine, but in the grand scheme of things, Jump's average battle shonen didn't go in the same direction. In the short term, some Jump manga tried to emulate the series, such as Sagaki Kake Otojuku or Kirara, but the signature style of testosterone-fueled aggression wouldn't last. Thinking of the last time Jump had a manga in a similar vein is like finding a needle in a haystack. JoJo is the best you can do given the stylistic similarity that endures when action comes into play, even as Araki evolved as an artist and a storyteller, but nowadays, the chic, slender, feminine touch Araki has introduced into his manga displays a divergence from what Fist of the North Star stood for. Besides, as I alluded to, JoJo isn't even in Jump anymore. Not long after its debut, Steel Ball Run moved to a seinen magazine. The primary reason for my argument that Fist of the North Star is different is the series being far more macho like the older manga of its time. Kinnikuman by no means isn't macho, but its goofier tone and setting started a departure from the more grounded, semi-realistic settings Jump's most popular action heroes resided in. Fist of the North Star's reason for being so macho is actually kind of interesting, as not only is it due to the author's love for action films, but rival magazine Shonen Sunday. Starting in the tail end of the 70s, and going into the early 80s, boys' magazines in the world of manga were experiencing a romantic comedy boom, thanks to Rumiko Takahashi's genre-defining Urusei Yatsura, published in Shonen Sunday, often accredited as the manga that introduced sparks of love that could finally be received and accepted in mass appeal for male audiences. Following close behind was the coming-of-age sports series, with a heavy rom-com focus, Touch, also from Shonen Sunday. These two titles are among some of the best-selling manga of all time, and unsurprisingly, Jump followed the competition closely, leading editors to question what should they do in the face of Shonen Sunday's premier titles. For a time, editors briefly considered following suit with the rom-com trend, as the series were so dominant that Jump itself acknowledged it. Within pages of 1983's 40th issue, coverage of Comiket, one of the largest fan conventions, noted the absurd popularity of Lum. However, before Jump could guide the magazine to more rom-coms, Gaki Daisho author Hiroshi Motomiya pushed back, believing Jump should double down on its masculine identity, with series that kept their macho nature as the primary hook. The editors ultimately agreed with his point of view, which allowed for the birth of Fist of the North Star, helmed by the duo of Yoshiyuki Okamura, better known by his pen name Burrison, and Tetsuo Hara. Burrison already had prior experience, with writing a successful manga in the form of Jump's 29-volume Doberman Deka, aided by artist Shinji Hiramatsu. Tetsuo Hara, on the other hand, had yet to find such a success, despite already being recognized as a skilled artist by Jump editor Nobuhiko Hori, and working as an assistant for Yoshihiro Takahashi, Ginga Nagare Boshigin. His debut series Iron Dawn Quixote was ultimately cancelled after 10 weeks, the underlying reason being Tetsuo Hara's aversion to the writing aspect of manga making, as he'd admit in later interviews. To be honest, from the very beginning, I've never been very good at coming up with storylines, and really wanted to focus on showing off my skills in art direction and creating characters. Nobuhiko Hori, my very first editor, has worked in tandem with me since my debut work, helping to fill in for my weaknesses and further develop my strengths. He continues on to talk about Hori ultimately being the person who'd propose storylines for his manga, despite Tetsuo Hara's one-shots and debut series not amounting to any long runners with lasting impact. This method of creating a storyline stuck with him, as a means to overcome his weaknesses. A group effort of many different skills and mindsets could create something better than the sum of their parts. A natural result of both sides favoring a teamwork attitude, with Burrison being unable to draw, Tetsuo Hara's lack of writing skill, and Hori's eye for fostering the talent in both, allowed for the formation of the legendary pairing. Thus, the rebellious Fist of the North Star was able to carve its own path in spite of changing times and tastes, showing how the action hero of shonen magazines wasn't going away, by doubling down on the roots of what attracted boys to those magazines. Fist of the North Star, if I may be so bold, is probably the manliest Jump would ever get as a result of this, cramming everything an adolescent boy would think is cool into a singular story. A lone man traveling through a post-apocalyptic world as the sole hope of humanity, with nothing else to rely on but the deadly martial art known as Hokuto Shinken. As a beacon of strength and true ideals, he bestows his judgment on those who indulge in their carnal desires. After a nuclear war, many are scrambling to find even the most basic of resources. In the confusion, chaos, and lawlessness, the strong utilize their strength to take advantage of the helpless. Greed is a common motivator for these men, but simple cruelty can be just as likely. The pain they inflict is often to no particular end. Their absolute power is used just because they can, leading to an inevitable showdown with Kenshiro. In these dramatic encounters, Ken more often than not shows no mercy. The power fantasy is justified by his enemies representing the worst humanity has to offer, while Ken represents our best. Behind the muscular physique lies a gentle soul, who will never turn his back on anyone who needs help. Most encounters end in a violent explosion of blood and guts, which may seem odd for a man who is supposed to be a gentle giant and a hyper-idealized protagonist who is above the cruelty of his opponents, but the story gets around this by framing even his violence and rage as righteous. Righteous fury for those who can't help themselves, righteous fury to represent the unheard, and righteous fury to show others that fighting back in this world is possible. Very rarely are words used to connect to the opposition when they've already crossed the line, unlike the prior Kinnikuman and future stories, which makes sense given the action films Fist of the North Star pays homage to. The 70s and 80s are home to some of the most iconic action heroes of both East and West: Arnold Schwarzenegger, Kurt Russell, Jackie Chan, Bruce Lee, and Yusaku Matsuda, to name a few. Fist of the North Star directly references scenes from many films throughout its run, and by Tetsuo Hara's words, Ken is specifically the coolest parts of Bruce Lee and Yusaku Matsuda, though of course writer Burrison is able to infuse more to the lone warrior, with his own inspirations. It was his idea, after all, to take a page from Mad Max, and drop Ken in a post-apocalyptic setting rather than a modern one. One of the biggest hooks to Fist of the North Star, beyond the aesthetic, is the drama. Upon the introduction of Kenshiro's brothers, the true appeal of the series can be immediately seen, that being men who harbor burdens that no amount of strength can circumvent. Kenshiro's plight is having love ripped away from him, and being unable to open his heart to anyone, all while being cursed to wander a wasteland, while being bound to a bloody conflict of fellow Hokuto Shinken users. Second eldest brother Toki has immense talent, but due to sacrificing himself to save Kenshiro and Yuria, he was exposed to nuclear radiation, weakening his body and guaranteeing his inability to be the true successor of the martial art. Eldest brother Rao, easily the most twisted among the bunch, carries with him an unshakable ambition to dominate the world and never let anything be taken from him ever again, leading to everyone, even the one person he still holds dear, to be against him. It's specifically the plights of these men that really gave the story its staying power as a franchise, given that the prequel series Fist of the Blue Sky ran for 9 years, and new projects still come out from time to time. Even though in my opinion, Fist of the North Star isn't as much of an influence on Jump going forward, since Ringi Kakero and Kinnikuman would remain more influential in a direct sense, Fist of the North Star still remains a manga worth taking note of, as one of Jump's most important action series, as not only does it remain one of Jump's best-selling manga, sitting at 100 million sold, but is still a touchstone of anime culture in Japan. It's generally considered the series that ushered in the golden age, due to cementing Jump on top. Furthermore, many authors were inspired to make manga due to the series, resulting in a further chain of inspiration that's quite large in its own right. Any hyper-violent action series that has come out since likely owes something to Fist of the North Star, JoJo's of course being the most iconic example. It's here that we finally come to Akira Toriyama's Dragon Ball, a series that needs no introduction. With Gaki Daisho, Ringi Kakero, Kinnikuman, and even Fist of the North Star, I felt as if they needed to be discussed, in part with the goal of recommending them. For Dragon Ball, however, that's entirely unneeded. Instead, I want to quickly summarize what foundations have already been laid and how Dragon Ball built upon them. Gaki Daisho had the prototype for Friendship Effort Victory before its codification, as those he met along the way helped foster his personal growth into a more compassionate, empathetic, and wiser person. Even his opposition held something to learn from. Ringi Kakero, as a story in part inspired by Gaki Daisho, carries on some of those aspects, simply adding back in the sport element contained in many early manga within Jump and outside of it, resulting in iconic tournaments, classic structures like arcs centered around simply rescuing one character, and finally, exaggerated special moves that stuck in the heads of those who read it. Fans at the time went as far as unofficially viewing the manga as sci-fi boxing. Then Kinnikuman hit the scene with its own tournaments that make up the majority of arcs, easily being the most popular at the time for its legitimate sci-fi of warriors from all sorts of planets and backgrounds duking it out, with no ability being off the table. Taken a step further with the ideological warfare introduced in later arcs, battles consistently displaying an idea the protagonists need to fight to uphold, or one they dismantle from their opposition, friendship versus hatred, perfectionism, learning to respect individuality, a bad upbringing not justifying revenge, among others. Where previous leads could gain an understanding of people here and there, the story of Kinnikuman specifically hinges the strength our characters have on whether they can understand themselves and the people they're fighting, to the point that most important battles can't be won without that other aspect. Uda Namago has said time and time again that they want characters to be able to join hands by the end. That seed of kindness and redemption grew and evolved within many manga post-Kinnikuman. Fist of the North Star debuted with its iconic Hokuto Shinken, opting to take its powers away from a loose sport or competition structure, which had been the most popular to house such leads for a long time, due to the gamified structure Battle Shonen often relied on due to its sports lineage. Finally, Dragon Ball synthesized much of what had proven popular in the past. The comedic tone of Toriyama's previous juggernaut Dr. Slump, the readability of a simply laid out manga, named techniques that people could remember perform, a rotating cast of friends and enemies, an action that continued to reach new heights. Toriyama specifically set out to make Dragon Ball as well received as possible, since he was only allowed to end Dr. Slump if he could make a manga that surpasses it. Before settling on Dragon Ball, previously named Dragon Boy, Toriyama and his editor had gone through many ideas before landing on something they thought would work. It was only when Toriyama's wife, an ex-mangaka herself, offhandedly mentioned Toriyama's peculiar tendency to watch movies while drawing manga, that the idea for Dragon Ball came to fruition, as this made Torishima curious enough to ask Toriyama what kind of movies he watches while working, and in response, Toriyama explained he mainly watched Jackie Chan's kung fu movies. Since he's seen them so many times, he knew what was going on without even looking, and could glance up when a part he particularly loved started. Naturally, since they were pursuing their next story topic, Torishima suggested a kung fu action manga. Toriyama already had a deep love and appreciation for those sorts of stories, which resulted in him being well suited to drawing a manga about it. Through a few coincidences, and capitalization of said coincidences, the two landed upon a tried and true storytelling theme that I'm sure neither at the time realized just how well suited Toriyama would be to write. With the start of Dragon Ball came the end of Dr. Slump. Despite the one-shot Dragon Boy performing well, and the initial weeks of Dragon Ball's full serialization being a huge success, there was a gradual fall in popularity. To remedy this issue, Toriyama and Torishima decided to go all in on the martial arts action, rather than still leaning on the comedy synonymous with Slump. They dropped the Journeys to the West road trip aspect of the Pilaf arc, then ripped Goku away from Bulma, Oolong, Yamcha, and unfortunately Puar, deciding to focus on the pair that would enhance their theme most, Goku and Roshi, with Krillin being added in later. In their reflection on why Dragon Ball was slipping, Toriyama and Torishima came to the conclusion Goku just wasn't strong enough to resonate with readers, so they gave him the goal of becoming stronger and stronger, then showed him training with Roshi. Following suit, tournaments naturally became a huge part of the story, which completely transformed the series. Great sports and action manga that had come before already showed how beloved they can be. Rini Kakero was an established gold standard, and Kinnikuman had taken over as the go-to place for tournaments, and was the #1 in Jump for a time. Toriyama was provably aware of both. He sent a letter to Kuramada, and referenced Kinnikuman in Dr. Slump. It's very likely he took inspiration from Rini Kakero at minimum, since he stated he'd like to draw a manga like it. As for Kinnikuman, it's hard to say, but nevertheless, Dragon Ball was privy to the structures already used in 2 Jump hits. As tournaments reoccurred, it wouldn't be long for Dragon Ball to rise to #1, far surpassing Fist of the North Star, which was Jump's current flagship title, and Kinnikuman that had held the position previously. Toriyama had a fine balance of Goku's progress being rapid, but never quite letting him reach the pinnacle. As a weekly experience, there was a hook of watching Goku train, fight dangerous antagonists, all while waiting for his well-deserved Budokai win. It wouldn't be until the end of the initial phase of Dragon Ball, with the defeat of Piccolo Jr., that Goku would get his day. The motivation of Goku and what moves him along from plot point to plot point is awfully simple, but through that simplicity and Toriyama's willingness to reshuffle the initial foundation of the series, Dragon Ball evolved the exaggerated power systems that had been building over time. The progressive escalation of the cast really hadn't been displayed in the same manner before. How far the characters got from what they were, while showing how a character's power can fluctuate and far surpass what it was prior. Kinnikuman may have quantified power levels first, but Dragon Ball used them more effectively. Generally speaking, a character's power remains stagnant in Kinnikuman, only going up an unknown amount from the power of friendship. The more versatile numbers of Dragon Ball created a huge culture in and of itself, of fans reading databooks, paying attention to interviews, and speculating on where a character is at, even when power levels were mostly dropped after the Frieza saga. Furthermore, once transformations came into the picture, the series made what's perhaps its strongest cultural contribution. While transformations had been seen in Super Sentai or Magical Girl series for a long time, Dragon Ball's numerous Super Saiyan forms that coincide with physical and mental struggle are undoubtedly what many turn to when thinking of the iconic Shonen power-up. A standardized style that would bleed into many series, where many forms or variations of a form are introduced as a character changes in some way. Super Saiyan displaying Goku's breaking point as someone who'd always been able to make things okay in the end, was faced with the possibility he was powerless before a tyrant who revels in the pain of others. It's not as if Goku hadn't seen anyone dead, but most of the time, it was before he arrived. Usually Goku coming into the picture was the first step toward the end of a conflict. This time was different. Not only did Frieza kill Vegeta, who seemed to be on the cusp of change before their battle even started, but he slowly eliminated every possible option. Kaioken, Spirit Bomb, and their teamwork itself. Battered, bruised, and out of options, Goku at the very least wanted everyone to escape, but he couldn't even have that, as Frieza went out of his way to ensure no one would survive, starting with Krillin. Through all of that mounting pressure, Goku unlocked Super Saiyan in a fit of rage, not only as a reflection of his turmoil, but a new sense of identity. Goku found out he was a Saiyan as soon as Raditz arrived, and it would take over 100 chapters for him to accept it, or in context with the serialization, over 2 years in real world time. Through Toriyama's talent for knowing how to escalate a story, the ripple effect engraved his name in the history of anime transformations, not as the literal creator of them, but the man responsible for what they are today. Every work since tries to take cues on how to give the character's next stage the same impact and gravity that Super Saiyan had for the story of Dragon Ball. I think what makes Toriyama such a good author is how well he pulls from many sources. We already know of Journey to the West or Jackie Chan, but when looking to expand scope, no genre was off the table for him. Sci-fi was something Toriyama enjoyed, even mentioning Alien, so he thought of the Saiyans. Continuing on the space angle, Frieza was born with the twist of him being like a land shark. Much like those who existed in Japan at the time Toriyama was thinking of his next villain. Then time travel felt natural as the next place to pull enemies since the characters were already so powerful after Frieza's defeat. Then we kept going from there, even to Dragon Ball's current form with Super. As a result, Toriyama shaped the progression Battle Shonen typically take, as many now look to Dragon Ball when thinking of how to up the ante with every arc. In the West, when we examine what's known as the hero's journey, many use Star Wars as an iconic example. How to structure a hero's call to adventure, their growth through trials and tribulations, and their return after transforming from the challenges they endured. Even though Star Wars was long after the term's 1949 origin, it's become a film synonymous with it, for being an epic in a simply told manner that not only drew together popular Western storytelling tropes, but had world building and special effects that stood out among its peers. In the Battle Shonen space, Dragon Ball is like that, a new default when mangaka think about how to introduce new villains, showcase action, create memorable training, and what's needed to make a transformation stick. Toriyama didn't reinvent the wheel, but redefined the medium nonetheless through his execution. Toriyama is a stellar artist, and when you look at the flow of the manga alone, he hardly has an equal, especially during serialization. I don't say this to discount the artistry present in Jump at the time, nor the countless manga magazines with works I've never even tried, but it's widely acknowledged Toriyama was just on another level, which not only inspired a massive amount of the current faces of the medium, but created a new standard that everyone needed to rise to. Oda talks about Toriyama being one of the authors who convinced people that making manga wasn't a waste of time and a viable career. Kishimoto talks about growing up with nothing as a country boy but having Dr. Slump and Dragon Ball as his comfort through the roughest of days. Hiro Mashima acknowledges he wouldn't be a mangaka had Toriyama's works not been a part of his life. Hideki Sorachi always feels as though he can never live up to the legacy Toriyama set, but nonetheless was able to make something for himself through pursuing his idol. Togashi calls him a god, someone who allows him to push himself, and is the very reason he still has a career. Toyotaro, in what's the most simple terms, but nonetheless most gut-wrenching to think about, states Toriyama was his everything. There's many more across the world who have similar feelings outside of the anime space. I made this video not to tear down Toriyama in any way, nor to lessen his impact. I simply sought to show appreciation for authors who similarly worked hard in an industry that grinds its talent to the dust. It shouldn't only be when a creator passes away that we can fully acknowledge them for what they were and how meaningful they are to the stories we love. I love Dragon Ball. I grew up with it. I've experienced the series several times, and Toriyama is a big part of why I love this medium. Nonetheless, I don't think it's right for the history of Jump, the shonen demographic, or action shonen as a genre to be overshadowed by him. For transparency, I started work on this video before Toriyama's passing. Some parts have been changed with that context in mind. I hope I didn't come off as insensitive or abrasive in trying to explain what had been done before Dragon Ball came to the picture. Furthermore, for anyone who has gotten this far, this video in no way should be viewed as the complete history of Battle Shonen, as that's simply not my goal in making this. There's too many manga I just can't read because I don't speak Japanese. Many of us in this online anime space are still finding out about anime, manga, light novels, visual novels, tokusatsu, or games that were actually more important to the medium than previously thought. I'd be making the same mistake as the people who prop up Dragon Ball if I were to say the history I laid out ends at the titles I highlighted. Even as I write this sentence, and now recording it, I can think of blind spots among the titles I'm aware of. Never mind those I still have yet to understand. Nevertheless, I hope some value was derived from what I was able to showcase. For more information, I've linked my sources in the description, and if you want to ask me any questions, the link to my Twitter is available down below.